This is a really easy project done with just a few tools. So a couple of drills, and a circular saw, and a jigsaw, and a router. Okay guys, let's go build this. This is a great way to sit 8 people in your yard. It's a picnic table with a lot of class. It looks really big, but it's not hard to build at all. In fact, the tools that you see here, along with a table saw and a miter saw, are all you'll need to build this. And though it looks large and complicated, taken in individual sections, it's a snap to do. We use standard store-bought lumber. This is cedar, but treated pine would work just as well to build this project. So once all of this material's been prepped, it's time to break this project down into more manageable bites. So we've broken it down into 4 sub-assemblies. The first of which is a seat assembly, and that's it here. So we start with the bench rail. You'll see that here, and it runs the length. The bench rail has an arch in the bottom of it, and we'll be cutting that with a fairing stick. It also has a couple of notches that allow part of the assembly to log into that. Next, we have a couple of legs like this. There's a small notch in the top of the legs. We'll show you how to cut that. And then lastly, we've got a couple of cleats on the end here. And those little cleats have a radius on them, and that's a 2-inch radius. And the bench seat tops will go on at the very end of this project because we need that joint open for putting all the rest of these pieces together. As you complete that bench assembly, you'll really be doing a lot of the same types of cuts throughout the rest of the project. The radiuses may change, and the notches may be a little bit wider or shorter, but all those basic steps are all in the rest of the project, and once you've done the seat assembly, you've mastered them all. These are the 4 pieces necessary to make the bench assembly, and these are the seat rails. I'll start at the miter saw by cutting 2 15-degree angles on either side that will give me an overall length of 36 inches. Now the next operation here is to measure 5 inches in from each side. So we'll do that here. And then find the center of this opening, which is 26, so that's 13. And from this mark, 1 inch. Now I've used the material to put a small mark behind each one of my outside lines. And then finally, just the tip of a nail to provide a pivot point. And now putting my fairing strip in here, I can bend this back until I'm just touching that 1-inch line. So now that that line is there, I can cut this out with a bandsaw or with a jigsaw, and finally use this as a template to make that same mark on the last 3 pieces. Now that the arches are cut and sanded, I've joined all 4 pieces because I want to cut a centered notch 4.5 inches wide and 1 inch deep in this stack, and it's easier to do when they're all together. So by measuring to the middle of this and a 4.5 inch notch, like so, I can do my layout. I like using a circular saw, but occasionally it can be a little bit tough trying to get that blade to line up with exactly the spot that you want to cut. Here's a jig that works with that saw that will make this one of the most versatile tools you have. Let me show you how to make it. I'm going to start with a piece of 1/2 inch MDF. This is 12 inches by 15 inches. And I've made a cleat like this that will go on one edge, and I need to glue that down. And I want this cleat even with the back edge of the jig. Once the glue sets, it's time for the second part. Now to finish this jig, I'm just going to turn it over, take my circular saw, and I'm going to move it to where the blade is just about 1/4 of an inch from the edge over here, and I'm going to fix my stop there. I'll glue that down. And lastly, we use the saw to cut off that extra piece. Now what you've got is a jig specifically made for this saw. This cut edge will always let you know exactly where the blade is going to cut. And because it's used just for that saw, I will mark this with the number so I know that this saw goes with this jig. This is a great way to add versatility to your circular saw. So this is the cut line of my saw, and I'll lay that right up against the edge of my stock and make my first cut. Now I established my inside and outside edges. Now it's time to just make multiple passes. And finally, using a chisel bevel side up, I'll clean up all the edges. So now that this groove has been evened out and smoothed with the chisel, it's a perfect joint. It's an easy way to do these grooves, and using that jig makes it even better. Table and leg risers need to have the bottoms cut at 15 degrees. So I've set the miter gauge to that. I'll cut from this corner to the upper corner and then rotate my piece and do exactly the same thing here. That will give me complementary miters on both ends. There will be 40 cuts total, again cutting both the corners on all pieces. Now the next operation on this seat riser is to remove this little section of material here. And the reason we're doing this is that the cleat is ultimately going to sit on that spot. This holds the seat together. So I've used the cleat itself to give me the depth of this cut. That's my pencil line here. And again, using the same cleat, I'm going to lay that on my pencil line and move it until it's even with the top edge. And then finally, put my next pencil mark here. This is the part that gets removed. This part will be cut with the circular saw and this one with the jigsaw, and I'll mark all 16 of these legs. I clamp 4 pieces together. That makes one full seat set and gives me a better stable base for the saw. Now I'm lowering the blade until it just touches the horizontal line. And using a framing square to help guide the saw blade past the vertical line, I'll make one cut through all 4 pieces. And as always, I'll do a little test cut just close to the line and then move my square to make sure that the blade is directly on the line. And this is the seat cleat. Now there are 8 of these. And we're providing a little decorative radius on the edges of each one of these. So to do that, it's a 2-inch radius. If you don't have a compass, you can just use a tape measure like this, and it's got a small little cutout at the end. And if you hook that over the corner, it holds pretty well. And then by just putting your pencil in the 2-inch mark, use that to mark your radius. That will give you a 1-inch lip at this end, which adds a little decorative element. This then will be cut with a jigsaw and hand sanded, or if you have a drum sander, you can use that. So we'll be doing the same thing on this one side and that side on all 8 of these. I would suggest, because you're going to be doing those, rather than use this each time, use it one time only on a piece of 1/4-inch tempered hardboard. Again, make your 2-inch radius so that now you can lay out the radius on this side, like so, and you can flip it over and do the radius on this side. This is just scrap material. It'll come in handy, and it certainly simplifies putting all those radiuses on there. Now it's time to take this to the jigsaw. Here's a tip on cleaning up a jigsaw and edge. We've used a template like this to approximate where the radius is going to go. And then we can take this and cut with a jigsaw. But the jigsaw leaves some pretty tough lines on the side. And those can either be taken off with a hand sander or a drum sander if you have one. But as long as you've got the pattern, there's no reason why you can't use some double stick tape and use a router to actually clean that off instead. And that's what I want to do. Now, a couple of things before you use a router. If I'm routing here, I'm always routing left to right. And if I start on this edge and finish up here, there'll be no chip out. But if I tried routing this way, and again, left to right and starting on this edge, as that router bit that's turning this way tries to exit here, it'll most likely blow it out. So the idea is, whenever you're routing, just set up your pattern so that the end of that router bit pass is made against an edge that won't chip. This particular router bit is called a bottom bearing. So in this case, I'll take my pattern and double stick tape it to the bottom edge of here. This bearing will ride on this edge, and anything that extends beyond that pattern will be cleaned off. This will be cleaned smoothly and nicely. And when you've got a lot of them to do, this is the way to go. Now that all the pieces are cut and sanded, it's time to assemble each of the 4 bench assemblies. This is what it'll look like when it's done. This is our bench rail. These are the risers on both sides, and these are the cleats. And they're put together with screws, some bolts, and also some construction adhesive. Here's how you do it. So I'll begin by taking the seat rail and marking 3/4 of an inch in from either side. So once I've got them even at all edges, I can now attach them with 2 screws, diagonally one from the other. And I'll do that on the opposite side as well. I'll turn it over, and now I can see the actual lines that I put on, which I couldn't have seen before. That allows a much quicker placement of those uprights on the second side. And again, screws diagonally in each corner. From there, to secure that whole system, I've drilled 2 holes on each side, 3/8 of an inch in diameter, through and through. To keep the bolts from turning, I've added torque washers. Those are anti-turn, so as the bolt seats into those, they will not allow that bolt to turn. On the opposite side, I have a washer, a lock washer, and a nut. And lastly, I'm adding the 2 cleats, one on each side. They are spaced 3.5 inches in from the end of each one. I put a small pencil line as a reference so that I can put the screws directly into it. I put a little bit of construction adhesive behind each one of these before setting them with the screws. That completes the assembly on this piece. After the adhesive dries, I'll use a scraper to clean up any excess squeeze out. The next assembly is the lower frame assembly. That includes the bench beam on the back, and that runs from one end to the other, and this is a short bench beam. On the bench beams, they have a radius on each end. That's a 4-inch radius. That's here. And they also have notches on each corner where they will ultimately sit into the seat beams. Lastly, we have a small block on either side here that will allow for an umbrella frame. So that's the completed lower frame assembly, and that's next. Since the bench beams and the short bench beams both have notches cut at the same depth, I've done them both together. I've taken 2 of the short bench beams and put them next to the regular bench beam and did one side. And then reverse that for the other side so that all the cuts are the same. And then finally used a test block just to make sure the fit is nice and clean. We're now going to cut the curves on each end of these, and the radius here is 4 inches instead of the 2 that we did previously. So I made a template the same way. Scribed that line with a pencil on here, and then wound up cutting it with a jigsaw. And again, if cut this nice and smooth, leave it. If it's not, a little hand sanding will finish it up. Now it's time to assemble 2 short beams from 4 pieces. I've cut a short 1.5 by 1.5 block. That's going to be attached to 1 notch on one of the 2 pieces using construction adhesive and screws. Then I add a temporary spacer to the opposite end and attach the second piece. On the other side, I've just added some adhesive and clamped the 2 together. Prior to clamping, I make sure that I put a straight edge on the opposite side to make sure that those ends line up perfectly, because they will ultimately be attached to the big beams. So I'm going to use the same process to attach those spacer blocks to one side of the bench beam. Ultimately, those bench beams will be connected, but it's only after the short beams have been attached. Center the 2 short beam assemblies on the outside faces of the long beams and attach them with screws. Then you can remove the temporary spacers from the short beam assemblies. Use a square to extend the location of the gap between the short beams. We'll use that mark to locate and attach additional spacers between the long beams. The center gap that this forms holds the bottom of the patio umbrella. And finally, I've joined the 2 beams together, the 2 big half sections, with a little bit of adhesive and a few screws. The next part to make are the risers, and this is one of them. There'll be 4. They are inserted between the beams and they're notched at the top. Ultimately, they will allow the upper frame assembly to sit on those. This is how you make those. The risers get notches that connect it to the upper assembly. I'll form those using the same method I used with the bench legs. In this case, the notch is 2¼ inches deep, so I've cut a scrap down to use as a pattern. Once again, I gang the pieces together to extend my marks. Set my blade angle and depth. Make the first cut with my circular saw. And finish each notch with a jigsaw. Now to place these accurately, I've measured 17 5/8 from the end and put a mark here. And once it's in place like this and it's flat, now it's bolted through and through. Once I do this one, then I'll do the next 3 all in a row and we'll have all the risers in place. The next assembly is the upper frame assembly, and that consists of table beams, which is this one that runs front to back here, and then these small table beams on this side. Each one of these at the end have an arch cut in them. We've added blocks in here for the umbrella, and ultimately these will be notched, but not until after we finish the next phase of this operation. These are the pieces for the upper table assembly. This is the table beam, and these are the short table beams. We'll be doing the same process as we did for the lower, in that we'll be putting 4-inch radiuses in the corners of all of these. They'll then be joined together much like we did before. To cut the radiuses for all these pieces, and there'll be 8 of them, we're using the same template we did before. That's a 4-inch radius. I cut it with a jigsaw. And the cut was pretty smooth, but if you had to sand it, the hand sander will work perfectly. Using the same process as we did with the lower section, I'm just going to use a couple spacers on the short beams and then screw those to the long beam. And I'll do that with both halves. Once I'm done with that, I'll use the 2 spacer blocks that are for umbrellas and put the 2 long beams together, creating the total assembly, again, much like we did the lower assembly. Now you're beginning to see the enormity of this. It's really beginning to grow. So with a friend, we placed the top of the assembly here, this upper assembly, onto the risers that were standing on all 4 sides. And I wanted to make sure as I worked my way around that they stuck out the same distance from here. So I measured from this edge all the way around all 4 sides to make sure those were even. And then secondly, to make sure that the height from here to here was even all the way around. So once I've done that on all 4 sides, I'm pretty comfortable that this top assembly is parallel with the bottom one. So once I've done that, to hold this all together temporarily, I'm going to put 1 screw in each of these 4 arms. That will hold us together for the next step, which is cutting all the notches all the way around the top. So the last sub-assembly are these top cleats and braces. The cleats each have a radius on each side. They're 2-inch radiuses. They are set into notches on the top, and once secured, then the braces are cut to size to fit. The top braces are cut oversized so that they can be cut to size for the final fit. Now I'll gang clamp the 4 pieces to be cut, 2 of the braces and 2 of the cleats. The cleats are cut oversized, but in both of these I measure to the middle and then measure out 2 1/4 from each side so that I have an overall notch of 4.5 inches. That notch will be cut 3/4 of an inch deep. This makes it easy to cut both at the same time. Now it's time to cut the notches in the upper assembly, and we'll do that much like we did the lower. There is a slight difference in depth, so I'm lowering the circular saw to 2 1/4 inches. I wasn't able to use the sled because the combination of the sled's thickness and the circular saw would not allow me to cut to full depth, so I went back to using a framing square as a guide. So I've cut the notches on all 4 sides and used a chisel to smooth them out. Now we're ready to move on. So I'm placing the notched cleat into the upper assembly after first adding some adhesive to the joint. This is pressed in flush and tight, and a screw placed through the face of that into the riser. And before I leave this side, I'll take the temporary screw out and put the bolt in its place, and then finally, after tightening the bolt, remove the clamp. I'll do exactly the same thing on the opposite side. I'm now placing the braces where they'll join the short table beams. Once they're in place, I can mark the overall length next to the top cleats. Attach it to the cleats on the outside. Finally, I put a screw to attach that to the riser, and then remove the temporary screw and put in the 5-inch bolt. Once that's tightened, I'll do exactly the same on the other side. And that completes the upper assembly. Well, with the help of a couple of friends, While they held the table up, I placed the seat sections underneath each one of the notches. So the notches in these beams match the notches in the seat table. Once these are together, they will provide an exceptionally strong system. And all I've got left is to put the table top on and finally the seat top on. Now that all the table boards have been sanded, it's time to place them. And the most important one is the center one. It will establish the relationship of all the rest of those boards and the square of this entire tabletop. So a little caution here. The first thing is I measured from either end and put a mark in the center. And I know because these beams are 4.5 inches apart, if I measure from that center mark 2 1/4 in each direction, I get my 4.5. And I transferred those to the face. And because I know that my board is 6.5 inches wide, and the center of my entire layout here is right here, I should be able to measure 3 1/4 inches from this line. To make it easy, if I measure all the way from the outside, so fixed edge, I know that I'm at 5.5. So I'll make a mark at 5.5 on each one of these spots, so that when my piece is laid back on and I follow the marks that I've made, like so, this distance is 25 1/4. And this is as well. So it means that this center section, this first board, is centered. And lastly, because we're thinking about putting an umbrella in, I know that the umbrella is in the middle of these two. So if I measure directly here, and again, the width of this board is 6.5, so if I measure 3 1/4, from here to here, that is the location of an 1.5 Forstner bit that will provide the hole that allows an umbrella to go from here, and through the lower one. There's a lot of stress on this board. Its square is important to me, and also potential stresses from any umbrella. So that one will have construction adhesive. Once these are set and the screws are in, I'll put each board in line with these all the way to the end. The process takes a little while, but the most important one is the first one. Now that the center board is in and screwed down, it's time to plan for the next 4. So I'll do each one butted up against the previous one. I've used a straight edge to mark the position of the screws and measured in from each edge about 1 1/4 inches to put those screws so that they look like they're lined up. The only issue is the last board. When you get to it, remember that the edges are in a bit, so the center of that board gets 2 screws on each one of the runners and only 1 on either end. These will all be trimmed in a radius later. Once I finish that side, now it's time to get the other boards on the opposite side, and I'll do exactly the same thing on that side. Now that all the tabletop boards have been fastened, it's time to put the radius on each one of these edges. This has a nice little bow on the end. It's measured 4 inches in from each edge, so I've done that here. And then finally in the center, a 1/2 inch away there. So we're using what's called a fairing stick, much like we did before. And I'm going to take a couple little nails and put them right at the joint here. I'm going to set them back just about 1/4 inch. Like so. And by putting them against those nails and just pulling back this way, the center of that 1/2 inch makes for the radius that we're doing all the way around. So let me mark this first one. This will be our cut line. I'll mark all 4 sides the same way before cutting with a jigsaw. Once those are cut, I can hand sand away any blade marks on the edge. Then I'll route a round over on the edge to soften the corner a little. So it's finally time to make the bench seat tops. Now the radius is here, done with a fairing strip. The edges cut with a jigsaw, and finally the roundover operations are all done at the workbench. After those are completed, we square up these bench tops and attach them to the seat. Now what ties this whole bench together are the cleats and the beams, and these seats, when screwed to those, pull that whole bench together, making a rock solid connection. So this is the layout for one of the 4 seat sections. I've taken the 2 seat parts and put them together and made sure that they fit on these ends. And then we'll start the marking, and this is a little confusing. The first mark comes back at 2 inches from either side, and I put a pencil mark there. And at this edge, it's 2 3/4 in from the ends. And I'm going to connect those lines, those dots with a line, and you'll see them here in pencil. And now the front of this has a gentle arch to it, and this side has an inside arch to it. And again, we're going to use a fairing stick. So I've driven 2 nails in here, about 1 inch forward of that line, and it'll come right to the outside edge here. So by putting the fairing stick on here and pulling it beyond that edge, my line now starts here and goes to this end and does the same thing on the other. So we'll put our line here. And here. The inside is, this side is an inside curve. And again, with my nails in position, this is 2 1/4 inches here. So I'm going to bend that so now I can see my 2 1/4 mark here. Again, holding that in place. That's my mark there. Now, having gotten all of those spots in, these will all be cut with a jigsaw. Each corner of this is actually a 2 1/2 inch radius. So to do that, we're kind of cheating here and taking a 5 inch sanding disc. And if I just use it to touch the lines on either side here, I can literally lay out that radius like so. And I'll do the same thing here. And again, just using that to touch the lines on both the side and the bottom. Same cut here. I'm just repeating this on the opposite end. And then lastly here. They'll again be cut with a jigsaw, and when I'm done, I'll use a 3/8 radius bit to route a nice soft edge here and do the same on the bottom side. These then can be used for templates if you want to make your seats 2, 3, and 4, or you can mark each individual one like this and cut them one at a time. So this is our completed 2-part seat, and I've kind of temporarily laid them out here so that you can see what I'm doing. When we originally laid out the arches, we put a center line, and that's important. So what I want to do is draw a center line across the face of this that will match the first half of that seat top. So this beam extends a 1/2 inch further than these cleats, and the offset from the back of these to the front is 6.5 inches. So I'll make a mark at 6.5 inches on either side. And then again, because these sit back a 1/2 inch, this mark is 6 inches on either side. The center of this block is the center of this entire assembly. So to put this piece on, all I need to do is find my center line and then line that up with the center of this block. And even with the mark at 6 inches here on both sides and 6.5 here, that gives me just enough overhang on the outside edge. And now when I move this together, I can extend these marks so that I know where I'm screwing with these. Now that I have these in position, I'll be putting 2 screws through each section here. And again, I'm going to come in about 1.25 inches or so from the inside edge. And I'm going to come in about 2 inches from the outside edge because the end of that cleat and the ends of these beams are pretty close and I don't want to split them. So come in about 2 inches here. Now I'll repeat the same process to install the other 3 seat tops. After all the screws are set, I'll take a sander and clean off all the registration pencil marks on both the seat tops and the tabletop. Congratulations, you should be proud of yourself. You completed a beautiful project. This picnic table couldn't be nicer. Now it's time to find a nice sunny spot in the yard, put up the umbrella, and invite a few friends over to congratulate you on your workmanship. Nice job.